Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Joshua Kaplan. He is a reporter at ProPublica. Welcome to the program, Josh.
Thanks for having me on.
Josh, we spoke to Andy Kroll, I guess it was maybe a week or two ago, I can't remember, who had written this, or one of the writers on this piece that ProPublica did on Leonard Leo. And in that piece, there was a couple of lines in reference to Leonard Leo getting the sense that some of the Supreme Court justices, particularly Clarence Thomas and Scalia maybe, felt oppressed by the criticism they were getting and the lack of money that they were making. Supreme Court justices make $300,000 a year, but of course you've got to, you've got all sorts of expenses, I guess, associated with that. You've got to buy that yellow note paper, the legal pads, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you guys followed up with this story. It is amazing because it really provides insight to this dynamic. And let me just say also at the top of this, before you get into telling us what it was, I read that part of the way that the court packing thing didn't happen under FDR was the idea of increasing the pensions of Supreme Court justices at that time because they did not have very good pensions. And there was no encouragement for them to leave because they needed the money to stay in the job.
Yeah.
And by increasing pensions, it basically said, like, now's the time to enjoy your golden years. And this is sort of the inverse of that. It's fascinating. Tell us where this story starts.
Yeah, so we got our hands on some documents and other new materials that gave us this rare window into Justice Thomas's financial situation during a really crucial period in his tenure. About 10 years after he joined the court, when his relationships with these set of billionaire benefactors were really starting to blossom. And Thomas had become frustrated with his finances in that period, we learned. And we found that on multiple occasions, Thomas was privately pushing for more ways to make money, higher salaries, letting judges start giving paid speeches on the side. And those efforts, they weren't successful, but there is a certain frankness to some of this that has never really become public before. So, for instance, in one instance, Thomas was on the flight home from a conservative conference, and he happened to be seated next to a Republican congressman. And he gave him a warning that left the congressman afraid Thomas was going to resign soon. Thomas told him that Congress needed to give Supreme Court justices a raise, or else one or more justices would soon step down, maybe even within the next year.
And what year was that?
That's 2000.
2000. And so it was unclear who was going to be the president, right? Or is that, we're in the middle of a campaign. Yep. And the presumption was, it wasn't a slam dunk, but the presumption was the incumbent vice president has a very good chance of staying the president.
Yeah. And there was, we talked to, a lot of members of Congress, really prominent conservative attorneys. And there was a real fear in Capitol Hill at this time that Thomas might leave. The Senate Majority Leader at the time told us that this was a real concern that was on the table. And also this kind of chatter that, friends told us was more than chatter, that Thomas was dissatisfied with his financial situation, was also circulating in conservative legal circles back then.
It's fascinating because on one hand, okay, I think it's arguable that we should be paying, frankly, every public servant more money. I think there's a pretty good argument for that, frankly, certainly because you want them to compete with the private sector so that we can, slow the revolving door and whatnot. but and it's hard to sort of parse what was involved in this campaign. I mean, because you're communicating two things, right? You're saying like, we're going to leave if Congress doesn't. To say that to a congressperson is a different argument than, hey, there's a lot of opportunity for Supreme Court justices to make a lot of money outside of being a Supreme Court justice. And it's good public policy to pay us more, versus this sort of veiled threat that we're going to leave if we don't get paid more, because it's not like you're talking to your direct boss, right? It's
Right.
a weird dynamic, and it's hard to parse. Or do you have a sense from your reporting how naked was the idea of broadcasting this to, like, somebody's going to come and rescue me here, and you guys figure out who it's going to be?
I can't say definitively how far, what this crucially is, I think, is context for what was to come, which, as we've been reporting all year, in the 2000s and the 2010s, Thomas accepted a stream of expensive gifts from wealthy businessmen that appears to be unprecedented in the modern history of the Supreme Court, and mostly happened in secret. We're talking likely millions of dollars in value here, from private school tuition to luxury vacations around the world and private jet flights to pretty ordinary living expenses like tires. And some of these gifts were coming from people he had met very, very soon after they'd first met Justice Thomas. And what we discovered a lot about the gifts, there's still a lot we don't know about how and why this all happened, and precisely what led so many people to offer Thomas money and other gifts over the years. And so I think understanding how Thomas was viewing his financial situation and how he was talking about his financial situation in those early years is really important context.
Who was the point person for conservative, like, justices in this country at that time, and now? So in other words, like, if I'm a congressperson, a conservative congressperson, right? Because he's not calling up, let's say, Barney Frank at the time and saying, hey man, he's talking to conservative lawmakers, and he's complaining to them and making sure that everybody knows, I could leave because I need more cash. Who would these Congress people go to if they couldn't get legislation? And do we have any evidence that they even attempted legislation at that point? I guess is one question. Who would they go to? It would have been Leonard Leo, yes?
I mean, he was the Federalist Society is certainly the kind of preeminent conservative legal organization at that stage, and it was pretty in its early days still, in terms of, it wasn't the kind of, it was very influential, but it wasn't anything close to the monolith it is today. And we don't know that the congressman in that story I was telling earlier, that he ever spoke to Leo, for instance. But in terms of who was really engaged on this, one of the things that's so striking about that is this congressman, he was a vocal conservative. He'd been on the Hill for a while. He had a bit of a relationship with Thomas, but he had no engagement on these issues prior to this. He was not on the kind of relevant committees. He's not the sort of go-to person, which suggests that Thomas was talking about this with fairly freely, maybe. And this just happened to be the one that was very well documented, and we were able to get our hands on those documents. And also, I mean, there's several. For instance, this congressman, he gave a speech on the House floor about inflation eroding district court judges' salaries after this, and he was exploring legislation. But you would never, at the time, hearing that speech, have any kind of hint of what was sparking that.
He talked about district judges, but not Supreme Court judges.
He mentioned Supreme Court judges, but it was, he was talking really about, how hard this was for district court judges. Yeah.
I mean, like with Thomas talking about it freely, is this also potentially just an effort to be like, the right people and you can talk to the right people?
I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah,
there's still huge open questions, hanging over all of this.
Yeah. At one point, you report several people close to Thomas told ProPublica they believed that it was implausible the justice would ever retire early, and that he may have exaggerated his concerns to bolster the case for a raise. What do you make of that? I mean, they've made this argument that he was just looking for to bolster a case for a raise. But I mean, this is, again, it's not like this is an internal issue, right? Like, this is a public policy question. Maybe it would have been untoward for the justices to come out publicly to do that, but it's not inconceivable that if you really wanted to make it like a raise situation, like that was the most important thing. Because, I mean, it's not inconceivable. You get a 25% raise, which would be, basically the equivalent of $400,000 total at that point. But you would say, it seems to me, if it was you were advocating for a raise, you would be able to pick up the phone and call the judiciary, somebody you knew on the judiciary. You don't even have to know them. You're a Supreme Court justice, and say, you should have hearings and maybe have a statement from the Supreme Court. Like, had it been about a raise, there would have been a more sort of like public policy style debate about this, it seems to me, right? Or no?
I mean, yeah. I mean, to be clear, what these people were saying was essentially that they didn't think Thomas meant it when he said he might step down, and he might not have. I mean, he apparently likes to tell people he, wants to die on the court. And so maybe he was calculating, they were saying that, by raising this threat, this, the specter of losing this conservative icon, it would get a little more juice into his push to get more money, which it did. It scared
that's my point, is it?
Right.
There's a raise for your job, and then there's all of a sudden, I have a lot of really wealthy friends who are offering to buy my mom a house, to pay for my essentially adopted child's private school, to send me on trips, to put me on private jets. I mean, presumably we know about this stuff now. A lot of it we didn't know until you guys did this reporting. Theoretically, there could be other stuff out there we don't know about. But there's a difference between a raise from my job and all of a sudden I have just a bunch of benefactors. Yeah. And lucky, what a stroke of luck. And I should also add, when did Ginny Thomas start getting these jobs that she has, working for the Heritage Foundation or Hillsdale and all of these conservative organizations that have paid her a very significant salary over the years?
Yeah, that was right around this time. She was a Hill staffer for most of the 90s, but in the late 90s, she left to start working for Heritage, and then bounced around to Hillsdale, eventually started her own consulting company, which...
Has that been successful?
It's a complete black box. It's one of the great ways that the federal disclosure laws are set up is that since she made it an LLC, we know nothing about it. We don't know how much money went in. We don't know who she's worked for. The Post had a great story, if people haven't read it, earlier this year, about how Leonard Leo from the Federalist Society kind of had this directed I think it was another $25,000 to Ginny. And he arranged it in this way that so that there'd be no fingerprints to him or to his organizations on that payment. And in the memo or email where he was directing this money to go to her, he said, no mention of Ginny, of course.
Well, this is also around the time I just was reminded that, and you talked about the disclosures of some of this in the piece, that basically, I think around 2004, the LA Times reported on some of the things that Thomas had disclosed about the gifts that he'd received from wealthy benefactors. And the lesson he took from that LA Times story in around 2004, if my recollection serves me, was, oh, I'm just going to still keep taking the gifts, but I'm just going to stop disclosing it.
Yeah, I mean, and we don't know what, I mean, it's actually right around this period. It's a little earlier than that LA Times piece that we start seeing undisclosed gifts. It was around the year 2000 that there's the first luxury vacation that we know about that didn't make it into his disclosure forms. And in the 90s, when he was doing, when he was going on trips like this, as far as we know, he was telling the public. But right around this period where this conversation happened, he goes to Russia on Harlan Crow's private jet and goes on this cruise on his yacht through the Baltics. And other stuff like that is starting to happen too. And how he made that decision to stop disclosing these things is completely unclear.
There's a lot of really odd coincidences about the sequencing of this stuff, Josh. He broadcasts to everybody in the conservative movement that he's has an income deficiency, and then suddenly, luckily for him, his wife gets a job at a conservative think tank, which leads to other things, and he starts meeting all these people. I guess it takes a couple of years before you settle in at work until you start meeting like some of your new friends, I guess, and get paid. I mean, is there any, do you know how much of this may come up in the context of, I mean, I know the last I heard from the Senate Judiciary was that they were going to subpoena Harlan Crow and Leonard Leo. I don't know if they're going to decide to show up, frankly. But I wonder how much of this reporting, if you have any of awareness, is being looked at by at least the Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee, because this timeline is, like I say, either just shockingly coincidental or very, very damning. And it really does just seem to be like, basically, let's make sure this guy doesn't quit and he's happy, he's complaining, needs more money, and we're just going to deliver it through outside sources.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the next steps are for the Senate investigation. I mean, they have been trying for months now to get a more comprehensive accounting of these gifts, and rather than what me and a couple colleagues were able to find. And so far, Harlan Crow and Leonard Leo have both stonewalled them. The subpoenas really change, I think, that calculus. Certainly, at least until relatively recently, most people were very afraid to play around with a Senate subpoena. Although, with the current kind of partisan political environment, they might, as you said, they might be able to just blow it off, essentially. And I mean, I think, important thing to underscore here is that this is, I think the root issue in all of this is that the Supreme Court, has less oversight, less accountability, less rules about ethics than really just about any other part of the federal government. And, most places there would be processes for finding this out, and it also simply would not be allowed.
Well, just before we let you go, what do you feel like is the next piece of this puzzle? that we might hear about?
We're still actively reporting on all fronts. I mean, and online justices too, because Thomas has, as far as we know, doing this at a scale that is, kind of well beyond what any of the other justices are. But we don't know what we don't know, and in terms of how this all unfolded, and how we got to where we are right now, we still have more questions than answers, and are very much trying to answer them.
Josh Kaplan, reporter of ProPublica, great piece. We will link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.